الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Pakistan. We are delighted to have you join us today at this discussion on managing crises in emerging markets. In my welcoming remarks to you, I want to do two things. One is that I would like to talk to you about why we are holding this event, and second, I would like to share with you just a few points on why we decided to choose this topic. So first, let me speak to you about why we are holding this event. Now, as you know, the State Bank of Pakistan has many different roles that we play in our country. One, and the one that is known the best, is our role as a policymaker, and particularly with regards to monetary policy, exchange rate policy, financial sector policy, and what we implement in achieving our goals of price stability, financial stability, and supporting growth. But we have another key role that we would like to emphasize increasingly more, especially as we overcome our immediate economic challenges. And that is a goal that as an institution, we would like to be seen more and more as a convener and as a facilitator of debate on economic issues. Today's event is in this context. We wanted to take the advantage of the presence of Mr. Athanasios Arvanitis in Pakistan, who has been at the IMF for 25 years, and not only is the reviewer, which means he oversees the IMF's engagement in Pakistan, but also has the direct experience of managing many crises for the IMF, including currently, he oversees also Lebanon, Jordan in the Middle Eastern Department. Previously has either worked on or overseen crisis cases in Ukraine, Hungary. And back when I used to be at the IMF as well, Mr. Arvanitis as the division chief of the Emerging Markets Division, and when I used to be the division chief of the debt policy division, we worked together on the euro area debt crises, which now we have forgotten about, but at that time posed big challenges and had characteristics very similar to those of emerging markets. So we wanted to take advantage of Mr. Arvanitis' presence to be here today and to come to the State Bank of Pakistan and to share with us his thoughts on particularly how the experience in Pakistan compares with those of other emerging markets in the world. We also wanted to invite key members from the business and economic community of Pakistan. So we first wanted to partner with the premier business organization, and we could not think of a more eminent organization than the Pakistan Business Council, which is very active in public discourse, and I have had the occasion of talking on many occasions with Mr. Ehsan, as well as many other members of PBC. So we were very delighted that PBC accepted our invitation to do this event together, and we look forward to doing more events with other organizations as well in the future. We are also delighted that both Mr. Khurram Husain and Mr. Sakib Sherani accepted our invitation to be here with us today. Both of these discussants don't need much introduction. They are both very eminent writers on economic policy issues. If you follow their writing, they also often have different views than what sometimes we as the policymakers in Pakistan are trying to put forward. But I think one key goal that we have today is also to demonstrate that in our role as a convener and facilitator of debate on economic issues, we also welcome differing points of view, and we welcome constructive criticism of policies as well. And I feel that as a state bank, it's particularly important to continue to promote open debate, because we are in the markets on a daily basis. We oversee the financial system, and as a regulator, as somebody who's in the markets, I think it's particularly important for the state bank to make sure that it is not closed off to some points of view or to some risks. So we want to make sure that there aren't issues out there that we are not aware of, and that is one reason also that we welcome the presence of both Khurram and Sakib. It has dawned on me only this morning that, and I assure you, it's only this morning, and it's a coincidence that both of these write for Dawn. And I know we have friends from other newspapers as well, from the editorial staff, so I want to assure everybody that that was just a coincidence, and we were just looking at names of people who, we saw were active in the debate, and it just turned out that they are both from Dawn. Now, let me just speak briefly about the topic and managing crises in emerging markets. So you will notice that the topic is not managing crisis in Pakistan. It's emerging markets, and it's deliberately so because we want and we hope that in the discussion today, particularly when we hear from Mr. Arvanitis, we will hear a little bit about how Pakistan compares to other countries. I have noticed that often in the discourse in Pakistan, there is a presumption, or there is an implicit message that what is happening in Pakistan is very unusual, or that all the forces in the universe have conspired to produce a very unique set of challenges in Pakistan that is unparalleled in the history of emerging markets. And I, in my experience, find many things in Pakistan which are similar to the experiences of other emerging markets, also some things which are different. So one key goal that we have today is that we are hoping that the debate will come to a little bit about what are the areas in which Pakistan is similar to the experience of other countries, and what are the areas in which Pakistan is not similar, and therefore we need to think about, why are there certain things which are different in Pakistan. So the plan for the event today is that I'm going to ask Mr. Athanasios Arvanitis to come and share his remarks, and after that I will turn to Mr. Ehsan Malik, as the CEO of the Pakistan Business Council, to share with us his perspectives, particularly from the point of view of the business community. Again, I will request all the discussants to try to bring out as much of a cross-country experience as possible. And then after Mr. Ehsan Malik, just to keep it going back and forth, I'll maybe turn to Mr. Sakib Sherani to come and share his few words. I think he has a presentation. I've asked all the discussants to keep it only to 10 minutes because we have a lot of distinguished guests in the audience, and we do want to have enough space for their questions and answers. So after Mr. Sakib and then Mr. Khurram for 10 minutes each, then we'll open it up for questions and answers. I'll be the moderator of the Q&A. I presume, despite our best efforts to try to keep this discussion about how Pakistan compares to other countries, there will invariably be many questions only on Pakistan. So it will be my effort, as also wearing the first hat as a policymaker, not to get defensive about any of the questions, but to promote and facilitate the dialogue that will take place. But if there are some questions that stray completely off, I will exercise my right as a moderator to try to filter the questions and to protect the discussants as well. I'll just have one request. Today's meeting, after everything that I've said, is not a discussion on IMF's second review on Pakistan. Okay. There'll be plenty of occasion to talk about that, so I really request everybody for the 2 hours this morning to take a step back and think about Pakistan from a broader perspective and how it compares to other emerging markets. So with those remarks, let me welcome Mr. Arvanitis to the stage and look forward to hearing your views.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Governor Bakir, thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you. Distinguished panelists, I'm very happy to be having these 2 hours with you and with this great audience. Let me start by trying to rebalance your expectations, scale them down somewhat. Reza had some very kind words to say in the beginning, but I don't think that I deserve all the praise that he started with. So I will not hide it. This is a bit of an intimidating moment for me, not only because of all of you and the size of the audience, but also because Reza is himself a world expert in managing crises, with first-hand knowledge, not only in designing IMF programs, whether it is in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, and most recently in Egypt, but also he has been a key thinker, and he had a key role in designing the IMF's own policies in how to manage crises. So I'm very happy that he had invited me, and I hope that he's kind again in judging the presentation. Let me start with a caveat, first of all. What I say today reflect my personal views and do not reflect the views of the IMF. And now that I said that, let me dispel one myth up front. There is no simple one-size-fits-all model that we have at the IMF. No two crises are the same, and no two solutions are the same either. The notion that the IMF has a single model that applies to all countries might be popular in the press, but has little relevance inside the institution. So let me give you a sense of some broad considerations that inform our thinking in how we approach and try to address a financial crisis in a country. First, diagnosis of the problems is key. This is obviously true, but it's not a trivial issue. Sometimes a bad external shock can cause a confidence crisis which may temporarily affect a country's access to financing. The country may approach the IMF for support, but crisis management is typically easier to do. In many cases, however, the problems are deep, wide-ranging, and homegrown. Large budget and external deficits, overvalued exchange rates, structural weaknesses can all be at play. And many times, this could be the result of bad policies and mismanagement. Sometimes the symptoms may be obvious, but the root causes may not be. So initial conditions and fundamentals matter. The stronger the fundamentals, the easier to deal with the crisis. But when several economic sectors are affected, the solutions are difficult. Twin crises, fiscal and currency, or triple crisis, fiscal banking and currency, or fiscal banking and the real sector, are becoming more complex. The interaction between the sectors make crises much harder to deal. Balance sheets matter too. It is important to have good information and understanding of the health of the various balance sheets, sovereign, banks, households, corporates, and the interactions and the feedback loops between them. And it's not only leverage and debt that matters, but also currency and maturity mismatches. The exposure to interest rate and exchange rate risk may constrain policy choices, as for example, if there are large balance sheet currency mismatches, they may limit the near-term exchange rate flexibility that may be desirable. So the design of policies is very much country-specific. The source of the crisis, the initial conditions, the state of the various balance sheets could vary from country to country. Knowledge and familiarity with country matters, but also close dialogue with the authorities and other stakeholders to understand all these interactions. There is no magic bullet. The fund is often called in by countries when easy policy solutions are exhausted and pressures have become acute. This is because there is often a desire to delay the necessary adjustment in the hope that the crisis is temporary. In some respects, this conforms to the fund's perceived role as a lender of last resort in the international financial system. But delays can make the crisis deeper, the cost on confidence, investment, and growth higher. When pressures are acute, solutions are not easy. There is no spending your way out of a high public debt. In fact, there are not many examples in the world of countries that manage to reduce their debt by running larger deficits. Reducing imbalances is difficult and has an upfront cost, but doing nothing can be more costly for the economy. Some key decisions that need to be taken. Against the background of intensified pressures on the economy, the policy response generally aims to restore confidence, advance necessary policies to steer the economy out of the crisis while limiting the impact on the economy. These require a number of decisions. Importantly, decide and set medium-term program objectives. These need to be quantified to be actionable and monitorable over the course of a program. Once these are decided, it is important to identify, prioritize, sequence policy measures based on the criticality to achieve these objectives. In this regard, it's very important to understand policy trade-offs. Precisely because policies have an upfront cost, it is important to understand the implications, explore alternative solutions, and recognize possible trade-offs. The program designs need to be convincing to help the economy address its problems. Decide on the appropriate pace of adjustment, an issue that many times I can see in the press here. The fund many times is criticized for asking too much adjustment up front. But ceteris paribus, the availability of fund financing eases the pace of adjustment, as without it, a country will need to adjust abruptly to whatever limited financing is available. Still, in designing a program, a key decision relates to the pace of adjustment. A longer adjustment period, that is a more gradual approach, typically increases the needed financing. A key question often is the necessary financing available to finance a larger deficit, budget deficit or current account deficit? Is this additional financing appropriate if a country is already heavily indebted? Would a prolonged adjustment make the problem worse and the ultimate cost higher? Think, for example, a banking crisis or a currency crisis where time is of the essence and delays could lead to major economic disruption. That is, there are cases where front-loading the adjustment is critical to maintain confidence and prevent worse outcomes. Also, front-loading may be politically expedient as it can avoid problems of adjustment fatigue. That said, it's true that in some cases it may indeed be appropriate to make the adjustment more gradual and backloaded when this is feasible, needed financing is available, and fiscal multipliers are higher. Striking the right balance between gradual versus front-loading is always a very challenging issue. Be aware of the distributional impact of adjustment and policies to mitigate it. Who is bearing the cost of the adjustment, and how can policies support the most vulnerable? Adjustment is often easier when it is seen as balanced across society, creating a level playing field, fighting tax evasion, supporting social protection, encouraging growth. All of these are important issues. Partner with the other institutions to support a country's efforts. Some of the program's objectives may be achieved better by other institutions that have stronger expertise, the World Bank, the ADB, and others. Close collaboration and coordination with these institutions, particularly when structural issues are at play and structural reforms are needed, is important. Secure needed sources of financing. adjustment and financing need to adapt. A program that is not supported by adequate financing will not succeed. Many times the fund cannot provide the full amount of financing needed by itself, and coordination and support with other multilateral and bilateral creditors is needed. In a few cases where debt service is a key component of the balance of payments problem, a debt restructuring may be needed to close financing gaps. Securing adequate financing can avoid the need to recalibrate the program with more measures to cover financing shortfalls, which can be disruptive. With these initial considerations in mind, what usually separates successful from unsuccessful programs? Ownership. Fund programs have been more successful when they support a homegrown economic program. Externally imposed programs with little domestic buy-in usually do not work and go off track as soon as the pressures are eased. In this regard, we have found very important to integrate national reform plans to fund programs. Also, close interaction with the authorities can create an environment of trust and mutual understanding. Clear policy targets. A program needs to be convincing that it can credibly address the root causes of the problems. Just promises of future action is usually not enough to restore confidence or turn the economy around. In this regard, programs have to set clear targets and timetable of actions. For example, Brazil's program in 2002 was defined by the government's decision to increase the primary surplus to 4.25% of GDP, which was over and above what markets expected at the time, and which Brazil kept for several years. Similarly, Turkey during 2002-2004 targeted a primary surplus over 5% of GDP to instill confidence in its public finances. These targets became key anchors for these programs. Generally, targets need to be ambitious, but feasible to achieve the objectives that have been set while also taking into account implementation capacity and reform payoffs. Structural conditionality needs to be macrocritical to avoid overburdening implementation capacity. Conditionality was most successful when it was focused on the key challenges and was clear how to address the problem. Consistent implementation. Slippages and debates were avoided in successful program cases. Meeting program targets is particularly important for reassuring markets and the public. For example, Ireland, by consistently implementing program commitments, managed to separate itself from other euro area programs. In the opposite case, frequent program interactions, renegotiation of targets, backtracking can erode program credibility and lead to frustration. This does not mean that program measures never change. At times, programs need to adapt to changing circumstances. It is important, however, not to lose sight of what they try to achieve and explain how the new measures help the overarching objectives of the program. Growth-enhancing measures need to support the adjustment. Weak growth and rising unemployment can create social pressures. Reforms to remove impediments and create an enabling environment for investment and growth should supplement adjustment measures. As growth may not reach everyone, it is also important to strengthen social safety net to protect those in need. And finally, effective communication. Communicating the strategy is of critical importance so that the public and markets understand the purpose of measures. The Irish authorities were particularly effective in communicating their program to the general public, market participants, and Troika partners. Moving on from these broader considerations, let me say a few words about the current program with Pakistan. I believe that the formulation of the program includes many of these lessons that I mentioned above. Let me start by a short retrospective about the problems facing Pakistan only 12 months ago. In late 2018 and early 2019, Pakistan faced acute pressures on the back of large twin fiscal and external deficits and financing needs. At the same time, per capita growth had almost stalled, hampered by structural rigidities, a difficult business environment, large informality, and an overvalued exchange rate. In particular, large fiscal deficits on the back of procyclical policies had put public debt on an unsustainable path. Tax revenue amounted to just 12% of GDP, one of the lowest in the world, even for low-income countries. Priority spending for infrastructure, healthcare, education were all very low, while the social safety net was inadequate. Because of the increase in debt and the relatively short maturities of it, annual debt service needs had shot up to about 30% of GDP, absorbing significant fiscal resources, crowding out productive credit to the private sector, and raising the risk of inability to service this debt in the absence of new financing. There was an overvalued exchange rate, hurting competitiveness by undermining domestic production and exports while it was fueling imports. As external financing was not sufficient, large current account deficits also led to a steady depletion of reserves. A difficult business environment. As you know, Pakistan ranks low in most doing business indicators, including the World Bank's. Undermining investment, which is only about 12% of GDP, clearly insufficient to support the needed upgrading of Pakistan's capital stock and support future growth. In addition, weak performance, governance, and accountability of state-owned enterprises drained government resources and worsened the quality of services. When we started considering about the new program with Pakistan, the strategy was to restore sustainable growth, first, through necessary adjustment to reduce fiscal and external imbalances, and second, through implementation of reforms to support growth. Following extensive discussion with the authorities and many of you, key policies in the program included, first, the reduction of the fiscal and quasi-fiscal deficits through a revenue mobilization strategy and a strategy for cost recovery in energy and other SOEs. The goal was to reduce public debt to around 65% of GDP over the medium term through a fiscal consolidation effort aiming for primary surpluses of about 2.5% of GDP, again over the medium term. The implied fiscal effort is not very different from that of other countries in similar situations, whether it's Egypt or Turkey. But the adjustment in the case of Pakistan is aimed to be achieved by stronger revenue mobilization without cuts in spending, as spending is relatively low and social and development needs are very large. To this end, the program aimed at broadening the tax base by removing privileges, tax exemptions, special concessions, and other issues that are in the tax code. Lower public sector deficits will increase Pakistan's resilience, but would also reduce the grounding out of the private sector and permit more credit to the private sector for investment. Another key feature of the program was allowing the exchange rate to be market determined. A more competitive exchange rate will lead to expenditure switching, helping exporters and domestic producers competing with imports. A reduction in the current account deficit would also reduce the accumulation of debt that is needed to finance it. Expanding social and infrastructure spending, as these are critical for the development of Pakistan. The program aimed for a considerable increase over time in budgetary allocations for social programs, BIS benefits, cash transfers, affordable housing, and others. In parallel, the program included efforts to strengthen institutions and remove impediments to growth. This includes, in the fiscal effort, a more balanced, less complex, and cumbersome tax system, including through GST harmonization, personal income tax and corporate income tax reforms to improve tax administration. These are aimed at simplifying the process of paying taxes, reducing tax fragmentation, leveling the playing field, and reducing unfair competition for businesses that are operating in the informal sector. Along with more revenue, the program also includes better controls to ensure a more efficient spending of public resources. This includes measures to improve public financial management, to strengthen the budgeting process, bring increased transparency and accountability to public finances. A new law is envisaged to strengthen the independence of the State Bank of Pakistan. This is critical to enable the State Bank to deliver on its primary mandate of price and financial stability, which are critical for growth. Reforms of the energy sector to ensure efficient and efficiency, elimination of arrears, which are important also for better services. This includes updated legislation to depoliticize implementation of regulatory decisions and measures to ensure cost recovery and elimination of arrears. Also, the program includes improvements in the SOE governance, including changes in the law and the regulatory framework for SOEs, monitoring the performance, audits and publication of the financial statements. There are also efforts to strengthen the fight against corruption. This includes actions to enhance NAB's effectiveness in investigating and prosecuting corruption cases. In addition, strengthening the anti-corruption establishment in provinces by reforming the laws and ensure the independence and adequate financing. Finally, the program includes also measures to strengthen the business climate. These are measures to simplify procedures to start a business, streamline the FDI approval process, expand the use of e-registration, streamlining unnecessary regulations and red tape. Adequate financing was also secured. At the start of the program, Pakistan faced about 35 billion of external debt amortizations over the course of the next 3 years, with the bulk due to bilateral creditors. Along with IMF support, these creditors have agreed to support Pakistan reform efforts with new financing. I will stop here, but in considering this program as well in the context of the IMF's response to other crises, I would like to leave you with two thoughts. This program is much more than fiscal, and we are in the beginning of a 39-month program with 32 months still to go. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Mr. Arvanitis, Dr. Raza Bakir, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be here for the second time in about 2 or 3 weeks. We had an opportunity to co-sponsor something here in this very hall with the State Bank of Pakistan on about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So thank you very much. This is something that enables PBC to come into its own sort of life. PBC is all about advocating policies that are good for the country. There are many other bodies and associations, etc., that try and protect the interests of their members. We try and protect the interests of Pakistan. Our name starts with Pakistan, it's followed by business. So those are the two clear priorities that we follow. And it's a great privilege to continue to do that with the State Bank of Pakistan. Tempting as it is to go straight head-on into crises, I wanted to say at the outset that I've actually spent 10 years of my career prior to joining Pakistan Business Council in Egypt and in Sri Lanka. And those two countries must be competing very hard with Pakistan to be the frequent user of IMF. But I think Pakistan actually wins with 22nd program and with the 13th in the last few years. That said, I have to also admit that I haven't really come prepared to compare the crises in those countries and some of the other countries. There enough to talk about crises in Pakistan. So if with your permission, I would rather focus on what is happening in Pakistan. But before we go headlong into crises, we must recognize that there are significant positives in Pakistan. We are enjoying the best security conditions in the last 15 years. You can forget about the economy. If your security conditions are not right, the economy is never going to be right. In the last 18 months or so, the availability of power has improved significantly. We have a new government that came in about a year and a half ago with fresh hope. And two major leakages of this economy have been effectively blocked. This was the flight of capital abroad and also the deployment of capital into unproductive hoarding of land. Yeah? So these are very strong positives on which we can move forward. Now, to say that there are no crises in Pakistan would be wrong. The Pakistan Business Council and the way we look at the economy is through the frame of what we call Make in Pakistan. Make in Pakistan is the major objectives of Make in Pakistan are to promote jobs for the 2 to 3 million youth that become of employable age. It is to generate, on a competitive basis, value-added exports out of this country, not just commodities, because commodities, if you export, get converted into finished goods, which then compete with Pakistan's goods, but also competitive import substitution. Clearly, none of these three objectives are likely to be met if you don't have a level playing field for the formal sector through the documentation of economy and so on. So when we looked at the economy approximately 18 months ago, just prior to the last election, we recommended that whichever government was to come into power, the first thing that they must do is to sign a program with IMF. Why did we think IMF program was the relevant one to do? Because there was fundamental issues confronting Pakistan's economy. The big wake-up call in Pakistan is that the country has been deindustrializing. If you look back in the last 15 years, every year steadily the percentage of GDP that is contributed by manufacturing has come down. As a result, our share of world exports has also gone down in the last 15 years. In the same period, Bangladesh's went up by 2.6 times and Vietnam's by over 7 times. So clearly they were doing something right and we were not doing the right things. We were putting disproportionate share of our taxation burden on the very few. Manufacturing, that represents 12 or 13% of the economy, was carrying 56% of the load. By the way, it is still carrying 56% of the load. But clearly, if we follow the right policies, that this load would then eventually come down with a broader tax base. So these were the kind of fundamental reforms that we wanted the government to undertake by getting into an IMF program. Okay, so it did not happen immediately, but better late than never. And now we are in a program. We also said we developed a scorecard to measure the progress. This is not for the IMF program, but for our Make in Pakistan thrust. And we said one big thing that needs to happen, a fundamental thing that needs to happen, is that we must have competitive exchange rates. And so, thanks to the initiatives partly by the government of Pakistan, but also led by the IMF program, we now have a real effective exchange rate, which is approximately 5% more competitive than the key eyeball competitor export countries that we compete with. Yeah. At its peak, it was about 20% uncompetitive. So we have significantly moved in a positive direction. We had a free trade agreement with China, as a result of which we had become overly dependent on imports of daily use items, things like shoes and fans and blankets and so on. And our ability to export to China had been effectively lost because of China's concessional terms that they had offered to ASEAN and other countries. That has been also renegotiated, as a result of which at 0% duty, Pakistan can export, previously could export $5 billion a year, and now it can export $11.5 billion, subject obviously to capacity being there and other capabilities being there. So that is a movement in the right direction. We asked for cascading tariffs. You can't have raw materials and intermediate items taxed at the same rate as the finished goods. Fortunately, there is now a national tariff policy, as a result of which there will be a meaningful reduction in the duties applicable to raw materials and also to intermediate items. And of course, the finished goods would stay wherever they are, right? So as a result of that, we will move from a tariff policy, which is currently configured to raising revenue, to one that will be promoting industry. So that's, I think, a very positive move. We also were encouraging the government to adopt taxation policies that would enable scale to be developed through the formation of groups and holding companies. That had been very effectively achieved in 2010. It was undone by the previous government in 2016, but again, thanks to the reforms undertaken by this government, that has more or less gone back, not 100%, but it's gone back to the degree of about 90-95%, to the level that would now promote the formation of groups and therefore scale, and that should lead to competitiveness. So these are actually some of the very positive things that have happened in the economy. Clearly, there's much more to be done. One of the major issues that the business is facing, and I think I was asked to talk about that, is the cost of capital, right? But before that, Clearly, I think we must recognize, and thanks to the initiatives taken by the State Bank of Pakistan and by the governor himself, the amount of concessional credit that was running out has been replenished, and $200 billion 200 billion rupees are likely to be made available. But that said, the working capital cost is far in excess of what the industry can afford. You would have seen the results that have come out for 31st December year ends or quarter ends or half year ends. All of them, barring the results of the banks, are looking south, and some very significantly south. We understand that the role of the policy rate is to dampen demand. But my submission is that the inflation that we are encountering today is not demand-led. It is not demand pull. It is cost push. Let me just share some very back-of-the-envelope calculations. The January over January reported CPI was 14.56%. But within that, the weightage of food is 35%, and that experienced an inflation of just under 24%. So if you take that out, and that is all supply-led problems, yeah? If you take those out, what we are left with is only 6.4%. You shave another 1% on account of the impact of utility costs, we are looking at a real inflation of 5.5%. A 13.25% policy rate is simply not justifiable. And our submission, and we will keep repeating it until the cows come home, is that that is something that needs to be reviewed. Yeah? The government is trying to subsidize and make it more affordable for people who can't afford these very expensive food items. That actually is also working against the monetary policy. The very purpose of the monetary policy is to control the amount of money in circulation. The real emphasis of the government needs to be on fixing the inefficiencies that lie within our agriculture chain. So that said, not surprisingly, as a result of the very high cost of borrowing, the private sector offtake has gone down significantly. But private sector is also being held hostage to this high interest rate. We understand the need to attract foreign investment into debts, but that's coming at a cost that the private sector is having to carry, but also the government of Pakistan is having to carry. And we would really urge the government and the State Bank of Pakistan to look at alternative ways of borrowing through Eurobonds and others. Yeah. We still have a 100% LC margin requirement on industrial inputs. I don't understand what would be the logic for that. We all talk about the importance of exports, but really, aside from making the concessional funds available for export funding, there's been no change in the export policy. It is exactly the same as it was about a year ago, and perhaps it was about 2 years ago. The Pakistan Business Council has made some recommendations on allowing branding, for example. If you want to get into value-added exports, you need to develop brands. That requires more than 10% investment. It requires upfront investment. You can't do retrospective investment. You have to do prospective investment. If you want to go and register drugs abroad, Africa, by the way, has 54 countries. The minimum it costs to register a drug is $80,000. Yeah? That is required upfront. You can't take your previous exports and take 10% of that and do it. Amazon is taking over from the high street operators. Amazon, you can't sell anything out of through Amazon if you don't warehouse in the country that portal is being run. Our export regulations today do not permit that. Our export regulations also require money to come back within a certain period of time. They don't allow for bad debts beyond the 10%, right? So if you're going to be dealing with supermarkets, etc., they will do haircuts if they're not able to move goods, etc. So these are clearly issues that confront us. But one issue that I need to point out is the U-turns that the government is taking. The U-turn that they took, for example, on the energy cost that was made available to exporters. Absolutely not acceptable, and that is something that the government is reviewing, we believe. I'm reminded of a poem by an Irish poet called Yeats. And it's called The Second Coming. It goes like this. Turning and turning, the whitening gyre is, by the way, concentric circles, the falcon cannot hear the falconer anymore. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. We've got to stop working in silos. We've got to get all the government authorities, whether they are at the federal level or whether they are the provincial level, to come together. But the second line of this poem is actually something that gives us hope. And it goes as follows. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. I hope that is the case. Thank you very much.
Let me check if this mic is on. Can everybody hear me? So thank you, Ehsan Sahab. As promised, you are beginning to different points of view. So that is the purpose of the session today, is to hear different perspectives. And I'd also like to thank Ehsan Sahab for having managed to combine both poetry and monetary policy in one set of remarks. That we have not yet been able to do in our monetary policy statements, but we will try to get some inspiration from your nice remarks. Let me turn to now Mr. I think we'll go that way, to Mr. Sakib. Sakib doesn't need any introduction. He's a very well-known writer, and I think the founder of the first think tank, if I'm not mistaken, and the economic research institution. I think you know him very well. He's also been a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and also served in the government before as an advisor as well. So the floor is yours. I'm just going to enforce 10 minutes so that we can turn to our audience and we can turn to the questions, please.
Thank you, Governor. Governor, Mr. Arvanitis, Mr. Malik, Mr. Husain, and distinguished audience. I'm going to be slightly disruptive because I have a presentation. Doesn't have too many references to other countries, but I do start off with, I get up, next slide, Ajay, and next. Thank you. I do start off with a very sort of tragically apt joke, if you like, reproduced from Kamal Darwish about Argentina, which I think is quite relevant for Pakistan as well. And it goes something like this: if you visit the country after 20 days, everything seems to be different. You visit it after 20 years and nothing has changed. And I think that's the case with Pakistan. Tax to GDP ratios, savings ratios, etc., nothing seems to change. Political uncertainty, etc. So the need for reform is well established. However, despite 23 programs, we've not been able to move the needle. And I think a lot of the sort of introspection should be inwards, obviously. So, just listing off a sort of a menu of things that are potentially or have impacted Pakistan's inability to move the needle on reforms. Policy continuity is missing. Political instability has racked Pakistan since the 90s. Elite capture goes back to the 1950s, and it's actually becoming more entrenched in many ways. Lack of ownership, which Thanos mentioned, of not just IMF programs, but of the reform effort more generally. And a lack of a wide reform constituency in Pakistan. Really, everybody has their, I'm sorry to use this, I'm just reminded of what the late Ardeshir Kawasji said, everybody has their snout in the trough here. But, to say that everybody is connected to the patronage, and nobody therefore wants to really change. Misaligned incentives, even under IMF programs, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But also, I think IMF program design is to blame. And I'll talk about this last bit rather than other countries, etc. So very quickly, the characteristics of fund programs generally are that they're pro-cyclical. They can argue they need to be pro-cyclical. It's shock therapy, which Thanos said it's a great thing, and we may have different views on that. And despite the fact that Thanos said it's not fiscal, mostly fiscal, the IMF stands for it's mostly fiscal, and that's their approach. They have a monetary approach to the balance of payments, going back to work done in the 50s and the 60s, or perhaps earlier, actually, in the 30s and 40s. And the emphasis is on large price adjustments, upfront price adjustments, and withdrawal of blanket subsidies. And the implicit sort of assumption, it may not be there, and I'm sure Thanos will disagree, is, the Schumpeterian sort of creative destruction. So if private firms get destroyed in this, sort of process of reform, it's not bad. It's actually, in the long run, it's pretty good, actually. So I think that's something that we need to challenge, especially when private firms are bearing the brunt of a bad policy framework thrust on them. It's not their own inefficiencies necessarily. It's a policy framework, especially in the case of the 2018 crisis, going back to the 2008 crisis as well. So I think that's something that we need to look at. So the weaknesses are, once again, despite what the IMF would say, that they do not treat all countries the same, the fact is that there's a whole range of crises. They emanate from terms of trade shocks, they emanate from sudden stops, debt overhangs, they're credit-led, or there's an overhang, monetary overhang. And despite this wide range or spectrum of crises, the IMF has very similar approaches to all of these, right? So the countries may be dealt a bit differently, they tweak something here and there, but the crises are dealt very similarly, even though their genesis is very different and their trajectories and paths are very different. There's an underappreciation of initial conditions. The political economy, and I think time and again, the IMF has been stumped by this particular factor, but also, I think in this particular case, something I've been saying to them since 2013, they've also underappreciated the lack of institutional capacity in their counterparts in the government, especially in FPR. So this has important implications. Keep this thought in mind. I'll come back to this in a few slides. Why is this important? Now, also something which I don't agree, that the burden of adjustment, I personally think the burden of adjustment is not well thought out. In the 2008 program in which I was involved from the Ministry of Finance side as well, we were asked to make large allocations for subsidies to the poor, social safety nets. It's fantastic. But large part of the burden of adjustment was actually borne by people who were not in the BISP category, but in the lower middle income household. They were not being. So they were being crushed by large increases, steep increases in utility tariffs, in transportation fares, public transport, petroleum prices, etc., and they were completely uncovered and unhedged by the BISP scheme. So I think the burden of adjustment is not really well thought out. There's an agency conflict, a number of them, but one of them is that the IMF, by design, undertakes, to some extent with countries like Pakistan, defensive lending. And they want to bail in. Governor, I actually may not look that old, but I go back to the time when Anne Kruger was at the IMF. And she enforced the first default on Ecuador and on Pakistan bond. And the whole thought process at the IMF is to bail in private creditors. So only the IMF does not take the burden of adjustment, the private creditors come in. And I think we see this with our fixation, if you like, with hot money, with bringing in hot money into Pakistan as well, which is an IMF construct too, because they'd like to make sure that Pakistan's reserves are built, but also that they get the money back at some stage. So there's an agency conflict because this is not necessarily in Pakistan's interest, in long-term interest. There's a timing mismatch because IMF programs are triage. They do not allow for structural reforms. So if I were to ask Thanos here, how long does it take to fix the tax system of a country? He and I have a mutual friend who is a global fiscal expert, Dr. Ehsan Malik. He started working on China's tax reforms in 1994. So to expect the FPR to deliver a 45% increase in the first year means that you're not expecting them or you're not giving them any chance to reform. They just have to go after whoever's out there in terms of already taxed in the formal sector. So I think this need for speed is self-defeating because it sets up two negative feedback loops, and I'll just talk about one of them. The short-run revenue mobilization focus is on top of a pro-cyclical policy mix. So what it does is, one, it doesn't allow FPR to base capture, what we call widening the tax base. It's actually, the tax base is already there. We're only capturing 25 or 30% of it. We need to widen the capture of that tax base. So it doesn't allow FBR because every 3 months they have to come up with a 15% increase or thereabouts in the revenue collection. Also, at the same time, growth is tanking in the economy, right? So that's hurting the revenue collection effort as well. So what they end up doing is overtaxing the formal sector and the existing base. And that leads to what I've called a tax arbitrage between the formal sector firms and the informal sector firms. So Thanos correctly identified informality as a huge issue in Pakistan. Unfortunately, the design of the program is actually encouraging or incentivizing more informality, and therefore, it's narrowing the tax base potentially. If more formal firms informalize, it will narrow the tax base and it'll actually reduce your potential tax revenue. So that's the kind of feedback loops that we need to avoid and think through. So last slide, I'll just skip I think this was quite relevant actually for the governor, but I'll talk about this maybe over tea or something, the negative feedback loop with high interest rates, because it's feeding back into the budget as government as the largest borrower, and it's then establishing a larger borrowing requirement for the government, which is crowding out the private sector and leading to higher interest rates in the market. You know, so it's actually another feedback loop. So I won't talk about this. I won't talk about the impulse response function here. I think this is quite relevant in trying to get growth back in Pakistan, but I'll just come back to my last slide, which is what are the policy options? How can we tweak the program design? It's not tweaking the program design, actually, it's actually a fundamental rethink of the program design. So we need more heterodox policies, we need backloaded structural conditionality. So don't require Pakistan to increase tax revenues by 45% in the first year, require Pakistan to fix FBR over the next 3 years. That is going to be the biggest gift you can give to Pakistan, and I think the way we can get out of the IMF programs, perhaps not applicable to Pakistan, but a general comment, I think 3-year programs are set up to fail. We need to increase the tenure of fund programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sakib Sahab. Really appreciate, first of all, you sticking to the time. I was also struck that you had the very, very useful perspective of history, having been involved in the program in 2008, which I was not aware of. So I think many, many useful points. I think in light of your eloquent onslaught on the IMF, I will have to give Thanos a few minutes to respond after all the discussants have spoken, because I suspect that Khurram might add to what Sakib said as well. So I think once Thanos has all the stock, he can. But I would also request that perhaps in the interest of balance, it is also useful to say that if an organization is doing many things wrong, it's perhaps useful to also mention maybe one thing that it is doing right. So while Khurram speaks, I'll challenge you to maybe think of one thing that you think that the IMF does do correct or has done well. So it's a great pleasure to have Khurram with us. I'm sure you all know Khurram. He is the editor of the business section of Dawn and has been doing a lot of research as well on IMF programs in Pakistan. So Khurram, the floor is yours, and again would request you to kindly follow the example set by Sakib and to keep it to 10 minutes.
Okay, many thanks for this invitation. I'm an ordinary journalist. You might notice I'm the only one on the panel without a tie. That's because in my profession, only TV anchors wear ties. And as a journalist, I deal with the evidence of the eyes and the ears first and foremost. And when it comes to other things, taking a deep dive into economic reality, either through the data or through anything else, we rely on the experts. We rely on the experts such as Sakib and stakeholders such as Mr. Ehsan Malik to augment our own understanding. The apology is that I've been asked to also put my remarks or bring in a cross-country perspective in my remarks. I'll try and live up to that. But I'll live halfway up to that expectation by bringing in a longitudinal perspective. So when I look at the longitudinal perspective, when I look at Pakistan's history with reform, and Sakib touched on much of this as well, but when I look at the history of Pakistan struggling with the question of and Pakistan going in and out of the IMF for the past quarter century, just look at the past 25 years, there's one thing that I'm struck by, and which is that not once have I seen this country grow its own way out of its own balance of payments crisis. Over the past 25 years, I can think of 2 times when a period of stabilization has been followed by a period of growth. One of those was when the stabilization of the year 2000 that began with the standby facility of 2000 and the stabilization that ran up until 2002 was followed by a period of growth that began in 2002 and perhaps peaked sometime in 2005. So if our reserves were sufficient to pay for less than 1 month of import cover in the year 2000, by about 2004 and 5, they had peaked to the highest they have ever been. Pakistan had the highest level of import coverage, reserves that provide import coverage by about 2004 and 5, and I believe it was almost like 9 months at that point in time. Of course, all of that disappeared as fast as it came, because by 2008, we were back down to less than 1 month of import cover, and so that growth miracle crashed as fast as it came. And many of you, I'm sure, will remember what it was like to live through those growth years. Sakib and I remember for sure. We were in touch during those times, and Sakib was one of the people pointing out that this isn't going to last. The other example that I can think of when a period of stabilization was followed by a period of growth was in 2013, 14, 15, the third Nawaz Sharif government, where once again import cover by reserves and the growth rates rose, inflation fell during that time period. But once again, that didn't last, and by about November 2016, reserve accumulation had peaked, and from there it began to decline, leading us eventually, inexorably, to back to the doorstep of the IMF in 2018. The thing to note about both these events is that the growth was in fact driven by exogenous factors. It did not grow from the reforms that had been put in place in the period of stabilization, but it grew because suddenly in the era of Pervez Musharraf, we had 9/11, we had massive inflows coming from outside, we had a very favorable debt rescheduling that was done for us because we were back in the good books of the United States and they needed our services to fight their war in Afghanistan. And there were all of these sort of exogenous factors coupled with the fact that there was massive growth taking place in the world economy. Our export destination countries were in the middle of a very large growth spurt of their own. Our exports, as a result, found new market, not new, but growing markets in the traditional destinations. There was a big construction boom in the Middle East and the Gulf countries, and our remittances experienced. So all of the sources of our inflows suddenly multiplied without any fundamental change that had happened underneath it. The export base did not diversify. The tax base did not broaden. In many respects, the same apparatus of growth and capital accumulation that has governed our country simply underwent a massive volumetric increase. There were some reforms. We saw telecoms emerge as a major sector of our economy during that time, and they have brought about very fundamental changes, and in the years to come probably hold the promise for bringing about very deep-rooted changes, but nothing that we can really count as fundamental structural reform in our economy. And the second time round, it was CPEC. And you might remember there was a State Bank report, I believe it would have been released sometime in March 2014. That was the year when the Saudi gift had arrived, if you remember, and they were having a hard time mentioning the name of the party that had sent the gift. Where there's a paragraph that lays out all of the inflows that had come in during that quarter, and it has one line in it saying that not even in the period after 9/11 have we experienced a quarter in which such massive inflows have come in one go. So there was borrowing being undertaken, there was a simultaneous release of loans from bilateral agencies, there was a Saudi gift that had suddenly landed in, and our reserves suddenly skyrocketed in that time period. And all IMF targets were met in one go, like that. At least it seemed that way. The NIRs and all that was taken care of, and a space opened up in which growth could be financed. But why is it that, I mean, keeping that in mind, if we now look at the present, I can see three possible futures that lie ahead. One is, the question being, how do we move from stabilization to growth? Because we are undertaking stabilization, whereas for me, the real story is actually what is being done to lay the foundations for growth that will follow this stabilization. If you see credible work being done, and I'm pretty sure that those members of the business community in this room right now, those constituents that Mr. Ehsan Malik and the Pakistan Business Council represent, would feel much better about undertaking the sacrifices they are being called upon to take at this point in time, if they could see, see credibly, not in rhetoric only, but credibly see on the ground work being done and the groundwork being laid for growth to follow after the period of stabilization ends. But my question to you is, do you see that work being undertaken? Do you feel that confidence? So in the absence of that, there are three possible futures that we can now see. One is that we land up in the same situation we were in after the incomplete execution or implementation of the 2008 standby facility, which is we landed up with all stabilization but no growth. The economy, the deficits were gone, inflation had been brought down into single digits again, but the growth had not returned. Or we can wait for another exogenous event to hit us, and God forbid our country should once more find itself on the front lines of a superpowers war, or once more have to rely on imported investment or whether from China or from somewhere else to finance its own or undertake its own or to rev the engines of its own growth. Or we can somehow find it within us to undertake the reforms that lay the and produce the endogenous produce the endogenous roots of growth that will follow after this stabilization period. To me, that's the more important question here. Not how well is the stabilization going, but how much work is being done to put the roots of the growth that is going to follow after this stabilization has taken place. When we consider that question, there are two voices. I mean, to the extent that, again, Thanos talked about ownership, Sakib talked about the lack of constituency for reform, there are two voices that need to play a critical role in bringing about this change in focus, away from a focus only on the benefits of stabilization and how well it's going towards the next stage. And those voices are the State Bank of Pakistan and the IMF. These are two critical stakeholders in the reforms and in the growth process of this country. Both of them enjoy a wide mandate to comment upon and to give us an objective sense and idea of how well the policymakers are doing their job of laying down the foundations for future growth, how well they're advancing on the question of structural reforms, not only the macroeconomic stabilization. In the case of the State Bank of Pakistan, this is not only a mandate, but it's an obligation. Legally mandated upon you. The quarterly report of the State Bank is actually a document where the State Bank is directly talking to Parliament. It's a document submitted to the Speaker of the House and to the Chairman of the Senate, telling Parliament this is how well this government is doing in terms of its economic management. Both these institutions have an obligation to be as honest as they possibly can be when it comes to the question of evaluating the government's track record in implementing structural reforms. So we look forward as the program is implemented and as the second review report comes out, and we look forward as the next quarterly report of the State Bank is prepared, to a greater focus on this side. You know, if there are gaps in the implementation of the structural reforms, it's important that those gaps be pointed to rather than papered over. So in the couple of minutes I have left, and this is really sad, and I feel bad for doing this, but I just want to say that the most powerful constituency in all these reforms is the one that is rarely ever in the room when these conversations take place, and that's actually the poor. Just like the businessmen look forward to an era of where growth and profits will return, the poor look forward to that day when they will graduate out of poverty. And for that, they look towards a very different a very different set of reforms. They look forward to how well the government is doing its job in laying down the pathways through which they will graduate out of poverty. If not in their lifetime, at least their children. If you can reliably tell the poor of this country that we can't do much for you, but I can assure your children will not live in poverty. They will have a better life. I can assure you, you will have all the ownership you need for that program. If you can reliably persuade them of that. How do you do that? You need to upgrade your health spending as well. To simply give them a subsidized bag of flour a month and say, here, that helps them get through the day. It does not help them get out of poverty. So there is a very different set of reforms that is needed on that side. And there is a very different set of reforms needed on the growth side. So long as we see work being undertaken on those, yes, we can say that we will be breaking the past and the mold of the past through which we have traveled to come to this point. But so long as we don't see that work happening, we can say that all we're getting is stabilization and nothing else. And we've been through that story before as well. Thank you very much.
Appreciate your points, and particularly the point you made about the mandate that is given to the State Bank as well as to the IMF. But particularly speaking for the State Bank, I think what you said is very important. The fact that we have to be objective in our quarterly reports, which we present to the Parliament. And just want to emphasize for the sake of everybody that we welcome feedback from people, yourself, others, as to how well you think we are meeting that goal, and if you feel we need to do better in those reports or tackle issues that we are not, we welcome that. Now let me remind everybody before we open up the discussion as to the goal of this event, and one of the goals was to have a fora where we can have debate on economic issues, and I think from the discussants' comments, you have already seen a taste of that, and we are looking forward to the questions from the audience. But let me quickly emphasize particularly some of the points made. Then I'm going to turn to Thanos if you would like to say anything particularly on the broader points, and then turn to the questions and answers. But I think I want to appreciate Ehsan Sahib, what he mentioned, and he gave a token of appreciation, a small token of appreciation for the move on the exchange rate, which we were happy to hear, because often in the zeal to talk about all the problems, and we agree there are many problems, sometimes things that we have tried to do to help the economy grow perhaps don't get as much mention, but we appreciated the fact that you mentioned the move to a competitive exchange rate. Also appreciated what you mentioned about what we are trying to do at the State Bank to provide some targeted support to exporters in this transition while the economy is going through an adjustment phase. But because exporters are earners of high quality foreign exchange and build our reserves, we felt it's important that in this transition that at least the export sector gets some support, which we can then phase out once the economy begins to grow and fire on all four cylinders as we expect it to do. I think both Ehsan Sahib as well as Sakib Sahib spoke on monetary policy, and would just like to mention that we are trying to invest in our communication in the monetary policy statements regarding how the Monetary Policy Committee sees. Of course, its decisions may or may not be to the desire of everybody, but we welcome feedback if you think in those statements whether we should do something more. We also have started a tradition of meeting with analysts after the MPC and sharing with them the perspectives that led the MPC to make a particular decision. I would just also welcome, I think, more effort on how to talk about monetary policy, because I find often people just talk about nominal interest rates, and most economists would contend that we should talk about real interest rates, and we are trying to promote the discussion more in that space, that Doesn't make that much sense to compare the interest rates in Pakistan to the interest rates in the US because the two have very different inflation rates. We would also like to promote more discussion on measures of inflation rate, headline and core. That's been a discussion. We look at both, and in fact our critics sometimes don't realize that we last raised policy rates in July. Since then, headline inflation has actually risen. It's risen 500 basis points. If we only looked at headline and not at core, maybe the MPC's decisions would have been different. Core did not rise in that period, has risen a little bit recently. But we do try to communicate that we are, in our view, trying to look at all the available pieces of information, but we would benefit from more debate on how to measure the stance of monetary policy. Should we continue to just talk about nominal interest rates? Do we have a collective responsibility to try to talk about real interest rates and the role of headline, the role of core, and other things? IMF program design that Sakib has spoke about. I'm going to turn to Thanas for any comments he may have on the general approach that the IMF takes to program design. But in the context of Pakistan, wanted to mention that as the policymakers, we would not have signed up on any program which we felt did more harm than good. And we are convinced that the design of the program, the key elements of it, are designed to deliver achieving the goals of the program. We are cognizant that it takes time, and the period of time is particularly tough, because if it was something popular to do, it would have been done beforehand. The reason things don't get done is because they are unpopular and they are difficult. They are difficult because there is going to be some adjustment. We are confident that that the gains will come. I will also point out that on the external side, at least, as I'm sure the commentators would be aware, we have been overperforming, significantly overperforming, both in terms of the reserve targets, the orderly manner in which the foreign exchange market is now operating. And in our view, that's not an accident. We do feel that at least in these areas the program design was good, and we are seeing at least the benefits on the external side. There are areas where more needs to be done, and a program, at least the way we see the program in Pakistan, is not static. There is an original design at the time of the request for the program, but with every single review there is more information that comes to light. As more information comes to light, we look forward to a continued cooperative discussion with the IMF to see what are the areas which continue to need to be emphasized, and if fine-tuning is needed, tweaking is needed, new things need to be brought in. We are very confident that we will continue to have a cooperative, frank, open, candid discussion with the IMF. Now, Sakib Sahib had many more general points about how IMF programs are designed in general. I'm going to turn to Mr. Arvanitis for any reactions he may want to share quickly, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for their questions. So over to you, Thanas, if you would like to add a few comments, and then to the audience, both in terms of the reserve targets, the orderly manner in which the foreign exchange market is now operating. And in our view, that's not an accident. We do feel that at least in these areas the program design was good, and we are seeing at least the benefits on the external side. There are areas where more needs to be done, and a program, at least the way we see the program in Pakistan, is not static. There is an original design at the time of the request for the program, but with every single review there is more information that comes to light. As more information comes to light, we look forward to a continued cooperative discussion with the IMF to see what are the areas which continue to need to be emphasized, and if fine-tuning is needed, tweaking is needed, new things need to be brought in. We are very confident that we will continue to have a cooperative, frank, open, candid discussion with the IMF. Now, Sakib Sahib had many more general points about how IMF programs are designed in general. I'm going to turn to Mr. Arvanitis for any reactions he may want to share quickly, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for their questions. So over to you, Thanos, if you would like to add a few comments, and then to the audience.
Thank you, Teresa, and also thank you for the order of the discussion, because Sakib went first, and then Khurram in some way replied to some of the things that Sakib said. I think that, so let me start first with some of the of what Sakib said. And I think we probably agree on many things that we said in terms of the problems, of the initial conditions, of the diagnosis, of what are the challenges that Pakistan faces one more time. I don't think that in that respect we disagree. I think where we differ is on the approach that this program is following to addressing these problems. And I think here, so it's very clear that I want to support what Reza said, that this is not an IMF program. This is really the authorities program that we support. And I think, from my understanding, so, the authorities, as Khurram said, had essentially to decide between three possible futures. And it was a future of doing little and be in the same place in 3 years, wait for an exogenous shock that actually would change things, or actually doing something. And doing something, it may be costly, but it could take you eventually to a different place. And I think, going back to the initial conditions, the challenges that the country faces are real, and only are real now, but they have been here for a very long period of time. You are going to see, this, and Reza said not to talk about this IMF mission, but I would say only one thing, that this was a different mission that we had here. It was not only a mission for us to focus on the program, the next 3 months, but it was also an opportunity for us to step back, and this is something that we do once every year or once every 2 years, and look a little bit further out into the 3-5-year horizon and see where some of the challenges, and therefore this is our Article 4 consultation that we call it, and we did that. And we had 3 presentations to the government and to the State Bank, but also to the National Assembly. And one of the areas that we focused was the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. This is the UN initiative that actually countries have pledged of actually doing whatever they can in order to address some of the deep development and social challenges that they face. So at least by 2030, they're in a position to meet them. And we looked at 5 key conditions. 5 key conditions were education and access to education, healthcare, infrastructure, roads, sanitation, clean water. And Pakistan, I'm not going to give you the whole thing because I want you to wait until the report comes out, but Pakistan will need substantial investment in order to be in 2030 to meet these goals. Substantial investments in the order of 15% of GDP. Now, with a tax revenue of 12%, you can imagine how far, unfortunately, Pakistan is, or how short it will be in 2030 to meet the sustainable goals. I think in some respects, something similar, analysis in the government's mind, was that actually this program needs to be different. And this is the reason, my response to Sakib, that while we agree on the challenges looking across so many different areas, being more heterodox, which essentially means more backloaded program, less structural adjustment, less reforms to be, not to challenge the institutional capacity so much. I think it would have brought you even further short of actually meeting some essential social and development needs that the country has. Is it ambitious? Of course it's ambitious. Is it feasible? I think this is the big question. I think this is what you are saying, that actually, you are challenging the premise that actually this is feasible. I think that we're going to see it in practice. So far, what we have seen the first 6 months, the program is going very well. Yes, I understand. So, there is an upfront cost. I think that's what I try to say. So adjustment programs have an upfront cost. It's one thing to design a program for Sweden, but Sweden does ask for an IMF program. Usually countries that ask for a program are countries that start from initial conditions that they have big fundamental problems and therefore need to be addressed. But I think my message was that while the initial adjustment has an upfront cost and probably falls into a small group of people, I think it's very important to supplement it with structural reforms, to broaden it very quickly. For the business class, to give them the prospects that actually things are changing, and that's why the adjustment in prices is so important, for at least companies and businesses to see that the adjustment in relative prices gives them the opportunity to grow, and at the same time find resources to support the most vulnerable. And I think the government has taken the initiative to actually change this and scale up the spending on various social programs that are now. I don't want to really go for more because I think that you have a lot more questions on this, but I think the fundamental problem that given the initial conditions where Pakistan was in 2018, this could have been dealt more with less ambitiousness. I think perhaps accepts that Pakistan cannot change from this cycle of things where they are in the last 25 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Thana. So let us turn to the audience. There should be a mic that would be going around. I will ask 3 requests of people as they ask questions, and I already see a first hand from Ali. So the first will be to please introduce yourself and state your affiliation. The second is to please only focus on the question. We value your comments, but right now we want to focus on questions. And third, please state if the question is directed to anybody in particular or to all of the members of the panel. So Ali Khizr, I think, raised his hand from the Business Recorder. I'll already state his affiliation.
Thank you. I'll have very short comments that will build to the question. First, what the Khurram talked about, the 2 growth era we had in the past 20 years. So I just add one small thing in that. In those periods, like we have oil prices were below $50. So, and that's a fundamental exogenous factor we need to have in. The second thing is about the interest rate that's hurting the working capital. Ehsan Saab mentioned that. And ironically, the bank's profits are really going up. There is something fundamentally wrong in that. And that's what Sakib talked about, the crowding out. So in the past 10 years, when interest rate kept low, especially between 2013 and 17 or something, but this crowding out was happening invariably. So my thing is, you talk about the monetary policy, keeping the real interest rate high to have better saving rates. For that, I see the US, the treasury bills rates on the same tenor are lower than the bank deposits paid to the consumers. It's the other way around in Pakistan. And then you see this, in order to do away with this crowding out, you need to have a competition with the banks in investing in the government securities. That portfolio investment hot money is one avenue, and the other avenue is the domestic investor. I mean, I've been a proponent of this, that non-competitive bidding in the bonds and T-bills. But when I go and see the banks and check, the banks are not, I'm not talking to the president, but the consumer interface of the banks, they don't really encourage that. So I would like to think about back in 2007-8, that there was some SLR limits were used to impose. There were higher limits, so you can cap a bank's investment in government papers, so that could address the crowding out question. Now, the second thing on the investment to GDP, that's a fundamental difference. Like when you go on the higher interest rate and it goes down. But and in the past 10 years, if you see the investment to GDP is down, and when you see the investment, it goes mainly in the power sector. When you can give a incentive structure to have 27% returned ROE, dollar-based, why would any investment big investment go in other sectors. And then my last thing, and coming back to what the Khurram point was, like in two periods of growth era, there is a fundamental difference in the quality of the growth. Back in 2002 to 2006-7, your export to GDP peaked in 2005 at about 13% if you add the services as well, and your private sector to GDP peaked at 27% of GDP. In the last period, your export went down to 8% and your private sector to GDP went down to 17%. So the quality of the growth, and which leads to another crisis, matters a lot. So my question is, if we're keeping the interest rate higher, which is fundamentally a right approach in this scenario because of the external benefits, like in a way that your reserves moved up from 7 billion to 12 billion, and if you add the forward liability reduction, it's 9 billion. So I think this interest rate has to play a role in that. And I could see that how things have shifted in people thinking from hoarding dollars to converting into the PKR and investing that in that period. So, but that's creating a problem for public sector as well, where your deficits are high. So to bring a competition to banks through other areas, that can bring inherently interest rate down. So I think that's one area we need to look into. Thank you.
Ali. Let's move on to another question. There's one hand over there at the very back. Yes, no, right here, right next to you.
I'm Asad Rizvi. I've got few questions. Basically, this has never been taken up.
If you could state your name and affiliation for the benefit of everybody.
Okay, I'm Asad Rizvi. I'm ex-banker. I'm the CEO of CMK, Currency Market Estates. My question is that our real problem is liquidity. We don't have the liquidity in the system. And this I have been calling since last almost 10 to 15 years. If you look at our advanced deposit ratio, it was in 2006, as Khurram was mentioning that period, our advanced bank sector advanced deposit advance ratio was around 75%. It is now down to 56%. And I think this story, you can get the catch over here. The story will, you can get me what I'm trying to say. I think around 12 to 15 trillion should have gone to private sector, credit to private sector, which it did not. Secondly, we have been injecting liquidity through almost its last 10 years. High point was around 2 trillion, and again we are around 800 to 1 trillion. Basically, all the funds, the money has been put into government securities. That is to get hold of the deficit because you want to bring it down. And just, in your speech you said that spending is the problem. How can we spend? We are not spending because we don't have money, that being the main reason. And regarding hot money, I think that's okay. Hot money, we don't see any problem because what is the period of China lending? What is the period of Gulf lending? They are all for a short period. So I don't see any problem in treasury bill. That seems okay to me. And if you say that what's the 13% is too high, I don't think so, because if you calculate on the basis of 8% borrowing, or say Eurobond, and then you keep on giving, and what about the devaluation, the risk, they are taking the risk. So could you please make a comment, because I think this is a very important point, that we don't have money. Liquidity is the real problem. This is what I'm saying. Thank you.
And who is your question directed to? Okay, thank you. Let's take maybe one, I think since there were many questions to banks, Mr. Aurangzeb Saab, I would request you to ask a question, to not feel defensive, don't answer, don't feel obligated to unless you want to. But
no,
please,
it's just...
but please do ask a question.
Yeah, Khurram, thank you. Just a question for Mr. Arvanitis. Argentina was brought up in the recent past is one of the largest programs of the IMF, right, at $55 or $56 billion, if I understand correctly. And as I understand, the IMF team is back into Argentina earlier this week. So the question really is, what went wrong? And what can we learn as a country in sort of midstream of one of the largest programs under IMF, that some of the lessons that can be derived here in the country?
Good question. I think the gentleman in the blue jacket.
Hi, my name is Suleiman Mania. I work at Shajar Capital. So the question is, private sector lending was 693 billion as of January versus 775 billion last year. In real terms, it's actually down by more than 21% if you account for the inflation number. Now, on the quantity side, so that means on the quantity side, there's a decline of 21% year on year. Whereas looking at industry lending, that should be down significantly, much more than this 21% number. So my question is directed to Mr. Raza Bakir. Again, I'm a fan of yours. State Bank needs to push the banks to lend directly to private sector rather than invest in government paper. I mean, that is what the discussion is about. And if banks cannot really lend with the understanding that the economy is, let's say, not on a very strong pedestal, then why are they in business? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe one last in this round, and then we'll take a few answers. And I think the gentleman in the middle.
Assalamu alaikum. About 6 months ago, I'm Salman Hassan from INM. About 6 months ago, there was a fantastic seminar in which your chief guest was Mr. David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, in this auditorium. And the occasion was the launch of the National Digital Payments Strategy. The president gave a target, which is that he hopes that in 6 months, the RTGS system will be upgraded and the micropayments gateway will be introduced. So I want to ask you what progress has been made in that. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so maybe we can take a minute to address some of the questions, and perhaps we can start with the Argentina question and ask Thanos to speak on that. I know he has a lot of experience. Please.
Thank you. There will be a time where there will be a review and assessment of what went wrong in Argentina. I don't really want to go too much into this. I just would say only two things, because they relate to some of the things that I tried to touch upon in my presentation. One is the pace of adjustment. The pace of adjustment in Argentina was not upfront and fast. And that, in some respect, that combined with insufficient financing, despite that it was one of the largest IMF programs, did not create the confidence that was needed for the economy to start growing again. In some respects, because confidence was not restored, outflows continued at a very fast pace. And because the adjustment was slow for people to actually see where the things to be convincing, it didn't turn around the capital outflows. I think that's, I don't want to be too much on Argentina, but let's say how that relates to Pakistan. I think we really thought very carefully together with the government on securing financing for the next few years. One of the biggest sources of debt servicing needs was coming for the very large debt, particularly debt to bilateral creditors that was falling due in the next few years. There was almost $30 billion. And I think there was a significant effort from the government to actually present a program and get the support from these creditors to support with new loans as long, of course, as the government maintains and continues the reform effort. So that's why the reform effort is not only important for growth, but also important to secure the financing that the economy needs over the next 3 years to continue to meet its needs. The pace of adjustment, again, goes back into what also we've been discussing here. This is critical. This is extremely difficult to decide what is exactly the ideal pace of adjustment. But too slow a pace of adjustment that doesn't really restore confidence is not seen as convincing. It procrastinates problems that already exist. It would really bring back problems that actually, in the first place, it has been tried to avoid. Let me take one issue, so because I think Reza tried to address a little bit the issue of the interest rates. And I think, yes, nominal interest rates are high at 13.25. But you cannot have both a stable exchange rate and a stable core and say at the same time that inflation is too high. I mean, you could have had a lower nominal inflation a lower nominal interest rate, but you could have had a continued depreciating exchange rate. As an economy, you need to see what hurts more. Would it have hurt more, so you can have an exchange rate at 170 or 180, or temporarily an interest rate at 13.5? The purpose of this is not really to keep the interest rates at this level for long. And it's really unfortunate that at the time that we, and I think the assessment was that inflation had peaked, sometime in December, January, some supply shocks came to hit the economy. And these are not demand side shocks. It's not really whether wheat prices or sugar or onions or tomatoes. These are really some supply shocks that unfortunately has hit the economy now. I think Reza was very right. It's very important to focus on the core and make sure that actually there is not second round effects that are actually increasing core and therefore spread inflationary pressures throughout the economy. But if you think that the exchange rate adjustment has worked, and if you think that the exchange rate at 150, 160, or in some range are appropriate for the economy, then you cannot also at the same time complain about the interest rate policy. Access to credit, I would leave it for someone else to reply. But nominal interest rates are not the only reason that affects access to credit. And I think access to credit is probably the most important thing, the most important challenge for the coming months. I think it's very good to see that the banks can maintain profitability, that it's not a supply issue, but it's a demand issue. And I think this is the question. So, how do we address really some of the fundamental problems of how credit is allocated, and therefore we make more access to credit in this economy, because that would be where growth can come from.
Thank you, Thanos. In fact, I wanted to pick up on what Thanos said and bring it back to, I think, an important question or comment that Ali Khizr made, and also another question from the audience that pertains to the roles of banks, the role of banks in financial intermediation. And what I wanted to do was, in fact, ask two of our discussants to see if they would have any views on two related questions. One, which is very dear to my heart, is how do we increase savings in Pakistan? Because it is clear that to meet our growth needs, we are going to need higher investment rates. And if we want to finance that investment without recurring current account deficits, then we need to raise our savings rate. And I think Ali alluded to this, so I would welcome any views from either Sakib Sahib or Khurram Sahib on how we could increase savings in Pakistan. And a related question on intermediation. One of the core functions that banks perform is intermediating savings to investment and credit. And there have been questions from the audience about what banks need to do more. So perhaps it would not be appropriate for me as the regulator right now to say something, but rather I think it would be better if I can get our discussants, particularly Khurram and Sakib and Ehsan Sahib also, to see if you have any suggestions on these 2 points.
Can I just butt in actually here?
Of course.
I think the fundamental way to get people to start saving is to allow them to earn. And that only comes about if the industry is revived. Yeah? So job creation, I think, has to be the foremost. If you want to encourage people to save more, right? On that point, I think.
But even without job creation, there is a substantial amount of savings that are being absorbed by the property market, for example, right now, because the small saver that you are looking to tap, they want secure returns, and they want returns that are at least marginally above inflation. And then, of course, they are easily enticed as well by the promise of outlandish returns that certain unethical elements in the stock markets or in the property markets pull them in with. But if you can have more instruments that offer a stable, secure return that is at least above inflation, that would be a start to pulling some of this money that is otherwise looking to go into, reckless investments in the property market. And regarding intermediation, I think so long as banks are able to make, The short answer would be if you can do more to raise the floor that banks have to pay on savings deposits. They really should be mandated to pay more than they are. So long as banks can earn, and the opportunity to earn a spread between what government lending offers and what the rate at which they get their money from their depositors, you can urge them all you want, they're not going to go away from where their incentives are taking them. So some amount of a push is going to be necessary, and one place to perhaps begin is to find out if there's a way to make them increase. But right now when I go to a bank to open an account, I can confirm that if I try to open a savings account, the person sitting there actually actively steers me away from that and keeps discouraging me. And they come up with all kinds of things that I know that somebody even slightly less informed than me would probably buy into and say, oh, you're right, maybe I should go for the current account instead. You need to reverse that equation. Get these people to start saying, come into a savings account, buy our savings instruments. And maybe that can happen, I don't know, maybe they can be forced, or maybe there's a way to incentivize or something like that.
Sakib, would you like to add on these 2 points, particularly savings and intermediation and private sector credit?
Governor, thank you. I think I'll just add a few glib points on the savings part of it, because really it strikes me, even with the work that the SBP has done in many areas, that this is one heavily under-researched area. We've really not seen a study. I was in the bank for a long time. Ori and I were colleagues at ABN AMRO, and I still haven't gotten to the bottom of this or seen a study that gets to the bottom of this. So I think the glib points are, there is a cultural issue. I think we are culturally dissavers. That I think we have to accept. Secondly, there is a supply issue. The depth of the capital and financial markets and the availability of products is not there. But related to that also is that the lack of financial literacy and economic literacy, or financial literacy in this case, about saving products, about, that's really, unbelievable as well. Even when we talk about a city like Karachi, but you move out of Karachi to anywhere, I'm not talking about Fata, but I'm talking about the rest of Sindh, for example, and people do not know how to operate or open a bank account, or, so the statistics, better, State Bank knows better, the financial penetration is really low, and it's, strikingly low. So I think maybe State Bank needs to study this. In terms of intermediation, I think, obviously with high interest rates on government securities, banks are finding it for a long time now easier to park it there, and earn their rewards there, if you like. And also, it's also linked obviously to the fact that the economy is not as documented as it should be. And that scares the banks. So obviously they do not venture into, so we know in our time at, the banks in the 90s and 2000s, we have tried, or banks have tried to go into the SME sector or other underbanked sectors. But because of the lack of documentation, they've had to actually come back. So it's all linked to a holistic sort of a picture that I think the government needs to work more on.
Wonderful, thank you. I think I'll just add one point on intermediation and credit. And I want to first note that for the State Bank, we want a policy that provides the right set of incentives, and particularly when it comes to credit. We don't want a culture where a regulator interferes with the credit decision of banks, because banks have to be accountable for the asset quality of their portfolios. But one area where we are pushing is on the area of financial inclusion, and that is the pushing of credit, particularly to those sections where it's less, whether it's SMEs or it's agriculture or it is related areas. And I have to say, at least, I see presidents of HBL and UBL, they are both here, and both of these banks have been doing work in this area. And it's an area where we are encouraging them and others to do more as well. And particularly on agriculture side, for the first time in our history, the amount of credit exceeded 1 trillion rupees. And we'll soon, in fact, be going to Balochistan for a meeting of the association that we have with banks and clients on promoting credit to agriculture. So it's an area where we are pushing because we feel it is underserved, and we feel that in a time when there is adjustment in the economy, at the lower sections, people have credit constraints. And particularly if they can have more intermediation and more access to financial services, they can have less of a brunt of the economic adjustment that is taking place. It's an unfinished agenda, but one where I think the bankers here know that the State Bank is pushing, and an area where we intend to continue to push. I'd also like to maybe comment on one point that came up, I think, on more than one occasion, which is the word of hot money. And I've been, reading about it as that word has cropped up. And, it's interesting if I look at the history of this word, that back in July when interest rates were raised, nobody was talking about the fact that interest rates are being raised to attract hot money. Then hot money happened. And now I find a lot of analysis going and revisiting and saying, aha, interest rates were raised actually to attract hot money. And I want to clarify that and assure people that when the interest rate decision was taken back in July, was taken purely on the considerations of expected inflation. And between July and December, in fact, no incentive, nothing was provided for investments from non-residents in the fixed income market. So what happened? Suddenly people woke up one day and decided, okay, we want to buy Pakistan's treasury bills. If people think that interest rates is the only reason it happened, I would like to point out that interest rates, policy rates were actually higher in 2011. In fiscal year 11, they were more than 13.25%. But hardly anything came in the fixed income from non-residents. So something else has happened in that time period. And the way we look at it is that we actually want to encourage the development and deepening of our capital markets to the extent that non-residents think that this is a market where the risk-reward balance for them is appropriate. And, they take the interest rate, the exchange rate risk here. There is no hedge for them. But if they, in their risk-reward calculation, think that this is an investment they want to make, they also have the right to come in through the SCRA framework that Pakistan created. It's a framework that was created some time ago because Pakistan wanted to be an open country. And it's the same framework used for investment in equities as well. So we cannot also say, no, you as non-residents want to buy our treasury bills, but we as Pakistanis are going to say, no, you cannot. We have that framework and everybody has access to it. What we have done, and I find there to be some misinterpretation, is that the tax changes that the government did in January are actually to remove the disincentive for investing on the short end. Because before the changes in January, if you bought a treasury bill, you had to pay 10%. But if you bought a bond and you had capital gains, you had a tax of 29%. And that was a disincentive. So the changes that we worked with the government for was to remove this disincentive and make it 10% across the board, so that we encourage greater flows on the longer end as well. More than that, we have articulated that it's an area that we look at very closely as we look at all other risks. And at current levels, these volumes are a small portion of our total build-up in our reserve buffers. Our reserves on the balance sheet have grown from a low of 7 to more than 12 right now, so that's a 5 billion gain on the balance sheet. Our short position in the forward markets has fallen by about 4 billion, so that's a total gain of 9 billion in terms of the net buffers that we have. These inflows are about 3 billion. So we have 3 times more cover. 3 times more cover. We try to remind people who seem to think that this is the only reason why reserves have increased. That's not the reason. The real reason is the improvement in the current account. And also, the volume that is there right now at $3 billion is around 4 or 5% of the total stock of our marketable government debt. If you take of all marketable treasury bills and bonds, this amount is only 5%, which I guess is also a statement about the size of our public debt. But the point that we want to make is that it's a very small fraction right now, but one that we are, of course, monitoring closely, and if we see there are risks. It's also not a unique experience for Pakistan to have, and this ties in with the theme that we wanted to project today, that many emerging markets have had inflows of non-residents into treasury bills and bonds. Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, many other countries have had inflows. So we are not unique in any way in that respect, and many countries have undertaken measures if they felt that the nature of the measures was very short-term oriented. We monitor this carefully. We don't think there are risks there right now, and if we see any risks developing, we do our research to know what are good, sensible ways in which we continue to deepen our capital markets, but also we prevent any risks to our outlook. Now, the debate is actually very interesting, and I had thought that we would have a second round of questions, but we have run into the constraint of Jummah prayers. Despite all our goal to promote economic debate, we don't want to be seen as an institution that stands in the way of people being able to go offer their prayers, so we must stop this right now. But I would like to thank everybody who came, particularly Thanos, who very bravely withstood all the comments that he got on the institution that he represents. Ehsan Sahib, who we appreciate the partnership with PBC and his comments, and both Khurram and Sakib for their valuable perspectives. And we just want to end on the note that this is not the last time, and our goal is to have a regular frequency of an exchange on economic issues. And at the State Bank, anybody who has a different view on how things should be done is welcome. Thank you.